So, Act 3 of The Merchant of Venice. We remember that at the end of Act 2, Jessica eloped with Graciano. Excuse me, Jessica eloped with Lorenzo. And we remember that so in one sense, it's Shylock's first loss of the play, and he's about to have several losses, right? But his first loss comes with the loss of his daughter, and not only his daughter, but she takes gold and ducats with her as well. So, as Act 3, Scene 1 opens, Salarino discusses both the elopement of Jessica as well as news concerning Antonio. Salarino says, why yet it lives there unchecked that Antonio hath a ship of rich lading wrecked on the narrow seas. And so here's an interesting plot development that we hear about for the first time. And so Shylock says, this happens, this news of the wreckage of Antonio's ships happens at the same time that Shylock hears of the elopement of Jessica. So Shylock gets two bits of news at the same time, right? Shylock gets two pieces of news almost simultaneously. And of course, one of those bits of news is the elopement of Jessica. And the second bit of news is the wreckage of Antonio's ships. So one of the things that we may want to ask is, why does Shakespeare put these two bits of news together at the moment that Shylock receives them? Why put them one after the other? Shylock here vocalizes his frustration. You know none so well as you of my daughter's flight. And here he's lamenting the loss of Jessica, my own flesh and blood to rebel. And this is important because Jessica is called Shylock's flesh and blood. And of course, this is going to be important, right? Because at the end of the play, this issue of flesh and blood will also involve Antonio, won't it, right? And so the question to ask ourselves is, if the elopement of Jessica is figured as a loss of flesh and blood, why put this loss of flesh and blood next to the news of the wreckage of Antonio's ships? That's a question for you to consider. Salarino and Shylock continue to talk. Why, I'm sure if he forfeit, thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for? And so flesh is mentioned twice within the same scene, right? Jessica is figured as flesh and blood, and here Antonio is figured as flesh, but not blood, right? And that will be important because we know in the trial scene that Antonio will continue to be figured as flesh until that moment when Portia introduces this idea that Antonio, too, is a flesh and blood person. So that's something for you to think about. Salarino says, even if all of his ships are drowned, you're not serious about taking this guy's flesh from him, are you? You're not really going to take a pound of his flesh from him, are you? What good is a pound of flesh going to do you? And Shylock says, to bait fish withal, if it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. And we already talked about revenge, didn't we, right? We talked about revenge in Titus Andronicus. What is revenge? Well, the old biblical model of revenge, right, if we're going to talk about revenge in an Old Testament sense of the word, in the Old Testament, revenge is modeled as an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, right? And so revenge is modeled as a kind of a substitution, right? Revenge in the Old Testament is modeled on a kind of substitution model, right? And that this word substitution is going to be very important for understanding this play. So Shylock says, "What good? Well, okay, what can I do with a pound of Antonio's flesh? I'll use it to bait fish. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge." And so if revenge is a substitution, if revenge is a substitution of an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth, or as we said in Titus Andronicus, an arm and a hand for a head. Remember, Titus Andronicus gives up his hand, and instead he gets back just the heads of his son. If revenge is modeled after an Old Testament model of substitution, where one body part substitutes for another body part in order to complete the cycle of revenge, here we have a kind of substitution taking place where Shylock has already lost one kind of wealth in his life. He's lost his flesh and blood, and instead he's going to try and substitute for that loss by a revenge where Antonio's flesh will substitute in place of Jessica's flesh and blood. It will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 1,000,000 times, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heeded mine enemies. And what's his reason? I'm a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. These are some of the most famous lines from the entire play. I urge you to remember these lines. They may show up on the quiz. So, if there is a kind of pattern of quid pro quo, right, where a Jew is treated as somehow different from a Christian, right? Here in this long kind of monologue, Shylock says, we are no different from you. Just because you treat us as different doesn't mean that we're not as human as you. We are as much flesh and blood as you are, right? We prick when pricked by a needle, we bleed as you do, we get hurt as you do, we get sick as you do, we laugh when we're tickled as you do. And so this kind of Christian model where Jews are treated as categorically different from, less than flesh and blood as compared to Christians, is challenged by Shylock. And so what he's saying basically is a rather chilling statement, which is that I am going to take Christian example in carrying out revenge against Antonio. I'm not doing it just because I want revenge. I'm doing it because you taught me the model of revenge. And you know what? You've taught it to me so well that I'm going to teach it back to you, and I'm going to teach you better than you ever taught it to me. And so it's a rather chilling statement. One of the ways in which differences between characters is posed in the play is through religious difference. And interestingly enough, here in this long diatribe, Shylock is pointing out that religious difference really isn't different at all, because Christians and Jews basically are one and the same flesh and blood. And so the only difference is a difference maybe of belief, but really more so of treatment. The way the Jews are treated is really the only difference between Christians and Jews. From this, we shift over to a more lighthearted scene. It's the scene where Bassanio must come and decide which of the three caskets to pick. And of course, we already know from beforehand that Portia is already interested in Bassanio. She wishes, if she had the power of choice, she wishes she could choose Bassanio. But again, she's deprived of that power of choice, right? And so this is a very interesting scene in which this daughter, who has her will curbed by the decree of a father, will hope that this man will choose the right casket. But is that all she's doing? Is she just hoping that Bassanio will choose the lead casket as opposed to the gold and silver? And we already know, right? As audience members, I mentioned this in the last lecture, but we already know that Portia's likeness is in the lead casket because Morocco has incorrectly chosen the gold and Aragon has incorrectly chosen silver. And so the only place the suspense is all taken away. The only place where her picture could be is in the lead casket, and so we are hoping Antonio chooses the lead casket. Now the question is hope all that Portia does? Notice something different about the way that Bassanio chooses as opposed to how Aragon and Morocco chose. Aragon and Morocco did not have any kind of musical accompaniment when they chose the casket. Bassanio does. Music plays whilst Bassanio comments on the caskets to himself. And listen to the song. By the way, this is a song that Portia commissions the musicians to sing. Listen to the lyrics of this song. Remember, Bassanio right now is trying to figure out which casket to choose, gold, silver, or lead. Listen to the song. Tell me where is fancy bred, or in the heart or in the head, how begot, how nourished, reply, reply, it is engendred, in the eyes with gazing fed, and fancy dies in the cradle where it lies, let us all ring fancy's knell, I'll begin, ding dong bell. Notice anything interesting about the sounds of these words? Is it possible that this song might, in the rhyming words that it includes, be giving a clue to Bassanio? Remember earlier on that Bassanio has said that Portia had communicated to him earlier. Remember, in speechless words. Remember, she's already communicated to him within the strictures, within the parameters of what her father has said. She has already communicated her interest in him. Is it possible that this very same Portia, who has communicated with speechless words, right, with looks, as opposed to with words, is it possible that this very same Portia is now using a different tactic to communicate once again with Bassanio? Lo and behold, which casket does Bassanio choose? He chooses the correct one. He chooses the lead casket. Does he do it because he uses his intelligence to figure out that she should be in the lead casket? Or does he do it because he picks up on the clue that Portia gives to him? Or there's a third possibility, which is that does he do it thinking that he's relying on his own intellect and reasoning, but in fact, subliminally, all of the words that rhyme with lead are in his mind, and so, even in acting upon his own intellect, perhaps subliminally he's been acted upon to choose lead as opposed to gold and silver. I'll leave that up to you to decide. Portia is thrilled that she has been chosen by the man that she actually loves. Happiest of all is that gentle spirit commits itself to yours, to be directed as from her lord, the governor, her king, myself, and what is mine to you and yours is now converted. And this is an interesting word, right? Because we've already seen one form of female conversion, right? Earlier on, we saw Jessica converted to gold and converted to Christianity, right? And so this idea of women converted in materiality and in spirituality has already been raised in the form of Jessica, right? So the thing to ask is Portia converted in the same way that Jessica is converted. And we wonder if that's really the case. But now I was the lord of this fair mansion, master of my servants, queen over myself, and even now, but now this house, these servants, this same myself are yours, my lord. I give them with this ring, which when you part from, lose, or give away, let it presage the ruin of your love, and be my vantage to exclaim on you. And this is important, right? This ring is going to figure very importantly in Act 5 of the play, right? So she converts herself from an independent woman, a maiden, into his wife. Interestingly enough, she effects the conversion, even though he's the one who's chosen, right? It's she who says, I am now converted. Interestingly enough, right? Who's doing the choosing here, him or her? And even in this marriage ceremony, who is giving whom the wedding ring? Right? Usually it's the man who puts the wedding ring on the woman's finger. In this case, who is giving the ring to whom and putting it on whom's finger? And who is putting this condition that if you ever lose this ring, then our love is over? Because this ring is a token and symbol of our fidelity to one another. And so Shakespeare does some very interesting bits of substitution. There's that word again. We are substituting. Here, the gendered roles are switched, right? In fact, although she doesn't switch her garb yet, she's a woman to all external appearances. Nevertheless, she takes on the male gendered role, doesn't she, right? We talked about gender as created, something artificial, something agreed to, something that people create. So just as Bassiano wins Portia, so too does Graciano win Nerissa, right? And I won't read the lines, but Graciano says he achieved her mistress. Is that true, Nerissa, madam? It stands so. So there's a kind of double union, right? Bassanio gets Portia, Graciano gets Nerissa, and seemingly every man has his woman. Now, some bad news comes, and interestingly enough, it's Jessica who delivers the bad news to Bassanio. When I was with him, I've heard him swear to Tubal and to Chus, his countrymen, that he would rather have Antonio's flesh than 20 times the value of the sum that he did owe them. And I know, my lord, if law, authority, and power deny not, it will go hard with poor Antonio. So here Bassanio gets the news that your friend's ships have wrecked, and my dad is going to be after Antonio's flesh, right? So here is one kind of flesh that Shylock is invested in, reporting on another kind of flesh that Shylock is invested in, right? Shylock's flesh and blood reporting on Antonio's flesh. And so the parallels, continue, right? Portia says, don't worry. First go with me to church and call me wife, and then away to Venice to your friend, for never shall you lie by Portia's side with an unquiet soul. You shall have gold to pay the petty debt 20 times over. When it is paid, bring your true friend along. My maid Nerissa and I, meantime, will live as maids and widows. So Portia gets the news that Shylock will most likely not forgive the debt. And so Portia basically tells the men, you go off and do what you need to do. We are going to go and sequester ourselves in a monastery, not in a monastery, but in a nunnery, and you go and do what you want to do. So here, Portia, who has already shown herself a woman of agency and independence, right? She's already shown the ability to not only work her way around her father's imposition of a will that she shall not choose her own husband, she's also worked around the casket, the lottery system. She's worked around that, and when left alone with Nerissa, she tells Nerissa, you know what? We're not going to go to a nunnery like we're telling our husbands. Instead, we're going to get in costume, and we are going to see if we can't make the situation right. Interestingly enough, Portia and Nerissa, Portia in particular, decides that she is not going to accept Shylock's intransigence, his unwillingness to change his mind about taking Antonio's flesh. You compare Portia's plasticity, her ability to change her strategy based on men's intransigence, based on the fact that men are unwilling to change. Shylock will not back down. Um, it's a woman who's adaptable when faced with men who are unadaptable. When men put their foot down and say, I will not change, I will not move from what I've decided, it's the woman who instead decides to be a little bit more flexible. Antonio kind of voices something similar, right? When his companions tell him that maybe Shylock will, if we beg him, if we offer him more money, maybe he'll see things our way, maybe he won't ask for your flesh. Antonio, too, seems to take this kind of male attitude of unchangeability, right? Once you're set in your ways, you're set in your ways. Let him alone. I'll follow him no more with bootless prayers. He seeks my life, his reason well I know. I often delivered for my forfeitures. Many that have at times made moan to me, therefore he hates me. And so Antonio wants to just give up. Remember, Antonio is going to play a sad role. We said so at the very beginning of the play. And he never once has any hope that Shylock will forgive him. He even says the reason why he's not going to forgive him is the Duke cannot deny the course of law, for the commodity that strangers have with us in Venice, if it be denied, with much impeach the justice of the state, since that the trade profit of the city consisted of all nations. And so, because Venice is a place where there are people from all over the world, and so the only thing that can keep order among all these different languages and religions and colors, the only thing that is a kind of equalizer is the law. If everyone did not subscribe to the same law, there would be chaos. And so the Duke, even though he may want to take my side, even though he may want to take the side of the Christians, he has no choice but to obey the letter of the law. Shylock's got a bond, and he's got to honor that bond. So Portia decides in Act 3, Scene 4 that she's going to leave things to Lorenzo and Jessica's care. And she says, my people do already know my mind, and will acknowledge you and Jessica in place of Bassanio and myself. And so farewell till we meet again. And so we already talked about substitutions, and here is substitutions. Here is yet another substitution. We ask ourselves, as we look at all these substitutions, is the thing that substitutes for the original always inferior to that thing? Does it resemble that thing? Or does it have an agency of its own? And here, Lorenzo and Jessica will stand in for Portia and Bassanio. I'm not going to say too much about that, but you may want to write a paper about that. That would be a really interesting paper, this idea of substitutions in The Merchant of Venice. Here, Portia and Nerissa basically talk about the fact that they are going to cross-dress, and they will not only play the role of men, but they will do it even better than men actually play their own roles. So I'll read a little bit of this. I'll prove the prettier fellow of the two and wear my dagger with the braver grace and speak between the change of man and boy. This reminds us of Cesario, right? Speaking between the change of man and boy, wearing your dagger with a braver grace, speaking with a reed voice. This is Portia basically reduplicating the role of Cesario. In a manly stride and speak a phrase like a fine bragging youth and tell quaint lies, how honorable ladies sought my love, etc., etc. So she basically says, I know how to play a man. You just need to act like a braggart, right? And act like you know everything. And everyone will believe you're a real man. And Nerissa says, why? Shall we turn to men? And here she asks the question of conversion. Does converting mean changing the outward looks of something, or its inward nature? That's a very important question. What does conversion mean? Does conversion mean that you just resemble something, or does it mean that you change the very substance of the thing in order so that it becomes a duplicate, right? And here she asks, shall we turn to men? Shall we be converted to men? Shall we add a member to ourselves? Fie, what a question's that, if thou wert near a lewd interpreter. But come, I'll tell thee my whole device. And Portia does not believe that converting means changing your inward nature, right? Instead, she suggests that perhaps gender is something you put on and take off. And we talked about this in 12th Night. So I'm going to stop there, and the next lecture will deal with Act 4. There's a lot to talk about with this play. So I'm going to pause here, and the next lecture will pick up with the next act.